It's 1955, and the most glamorous woman in the world is standing in her kitchen at 3 in the morning, barefoot, making scrambled eggs for a complete stranger she just found crying on a park bench. No cameras, no publicists, no headlines the next day. Just pure, unfiltered humanity from someone the world only knew as a goddess on screen. This is the Hollywood they never showed you in the magazines, the moments that were too real, too raw, too beautifully ordinary to make it into the carefully crafted narratives of Tinseltown's golden age. What you're about to discover will shatter every preconceived notion you have about old Hollywood, because behind every perfectly coiffed hairdo and every dazzling smile captured by studio photographers, there were human beings with extraordinary hearts, devastating vulnerabilities, and secrets that would make your grandmother blush and your heart swell with unexpected warmth. Let's start with something that will change how you see every classic film from here on out. Those impossibly perfect stars you admire. Many of them were doing something radical for their time, something that studios desperately tried to hide because it didn't fit the manufactured image they were selling to America. They were being decent human beings in an industry that often rewarded anything but decency. Take Hattie McDaniel, the first African American to win an Oscar for her role in Gone with the Wind. The secret that the studios buried? She spent virtually every penny she earned buying houses in all-white neighborhoods in Los Angeles, not for herself initially, but to break the color barrier for other black families. When she was barred from attending her own movie premiere in Atlanta due to segregation laws, Clark Gable threatened to boycott the event entirely. The studio talked him out of it, but what they couldn't suppress was what happened after. Gable used his considerable power to ensure McDaniel received a percentage of the film's profits, something virtually unheard of for any actor at the time, let alone a black actress in 1939. He structured it through his own contract, hiding it from the studio's knowledge for years. Now, shift your attention to the men who played cowboys and tough guys on screen. John Wayne, the symbol of American masculinity and rugged individualism, had a secret that would have destroyed his carefully cultivated image if it had come out during his lifetime. Behind closed doors, this man who played the toughest characters in cinema was writing poetry. Not just scribbling a few verses here and there, but crafting intricate, deeply emotional poems about love, loss, and the fear of being forgotten. He filled dozens of leather-bound journals with his words, and after his death, his family discovered that he'd been anonymously submitting poems to small literary magazines under a female pseudonym for decades. Several were published, and literary critics at the time praised the emotional vulnerability and feminine perspective of this mysterious writer, having no idea they were reading the innermost thoughts of the Duke himself. But here's where it gets even more touching. Wayne secretly funded a scholarship for creative writing students, specifically for those who wanted to pursue poetry but came from working-class backgrounds like himself. He never wanted credit, never wanted recognition, because he believed that the world needed poets more than it needed another actor with an ego. Let's talk about Marilyn Monroe, because if there's anyone whose true story has been buried under layers of myth and exploitation, it's her. Everyone knows about the blonde bombshell, the sex symbol, the tragic ending. But what about the Marilyn who spent her Tuesday evenings tutoring underprivileged children in reading? The studio absolutely forbade her from doing this because they thought it would damage her dumb blonde image, which they'd spent millions cultivating. So what did she do? She wore disguises, ugly wigs, thick glasses, and dowdy clothes, and she'd take the bus to a community center in South Central Los Angeles where she'd help kids ages 6 to 12 discover the magic of words. One of her students, who didn't know her real identity until decades later when he saw an old photograph, became a celebrated author. He dedicated his first novel to the kind lady with the sad eyes who taught me that stories could save your life. Marilyn kept every piece of writing these children ever gave her, every crayon drawing, every misspelled thank you note. They were found in a storage unit after her death, carefully preserved in acid-free folders, treated with more care than some of her most famous possessions. Speaking of secrets that reveal character, let's journey into the world of Cary Grant, the epitome of sophistication and charm. This man made millions playing wealthy, cultured gentleman, but his secret addiction? Thrift stores. Cary Grant was obsessed with thrift stores and second-hand shops. But not for himself. Here's the twist. He would spend his Sundays driving to different thrift stores across Los Angeles, buying up men's suits that were in good condition. He'd then have them professionally cleaned and tailored, and he'd anonymously donate them to organizations that helped formerly incarcerated men trying to re-enter the workforce. He believed that a man couldn't get a fair shot at a job interview if he didn't have a decent suit to wear. Grant grew up in poverty in England, and he never forgot what it felt like to be judged by your appearance before anyone heard what you had to say. He kept meticulous records of every suit he donated, over 4,000 during his lifetime, each one accompanied by a handwritten note tucked into the breast pocket that simply said, "You are worthy of good things. This is your fresh start." Some men kept those notes for the rest of their lives, having no idea they came from one of Hollywood's biggest stars. Now, prepare yourself for this one because it involves one of the most iconic tough guys in cinema history, Humphrey Bogart. The secret that Bogart took to his grave. He was terrified of horses. Absolutely petrified. This man who played hardened detectives and world-weary heroes would break into a cold sweat at the sight of a horse. During the filming of any movie that required him to be near horses, he required a handler to stay within 3 feet of him at all times, and he'd have anxiety attacks in his trailer before scenes involving the animals. But here's the beautiful part. When he learned that his co-star Katharine Hepburn had a similar fear of dogs, he spent weeks researching phobias and therapeutic techniques. He created a support system for her on set, distracting her before scenes with dogs, teaching her breathing exercises, and even arranging for a therapist who specialized in animal phobias to be available during the shoot. He never told her about his own horse phobia, not because he was too proud, but because he didn't want her to feel obligated to reciprocate the help. He just wanted her to be comfortable, to do her best work, and to not feel alone in her fear. Hepburn only found out about his kindness being rooted in personal understanding years later, and she said it was one of the most profound acts of empathy she'd experienced in an industry not known for empathy. Let's dive into the world of the glamorous leading ladies, because if you think their lives were all champagne and diamonds, you're in for a revelation. Audrey Hepburn's secret has been somewhat documented in recent years, but what people don't know is the extent of her trauma and how it shaped everything she did. During World War II in the Netherlands, young Audrey witnessed horrors that no child should ever see. She suffered from severe malnutrition, and her family was devastated by the Nazi occupation. But here's the secret part. After she became a star, she couldn't sleep in comfortable beds. She would often sleep on the floor of her bedroom because soft mattresses gave her anxiety, reminding her too much of how far she'd come from those days of deprivation. Her husband would find her curled up on the hardwood floor with just a thin blanket, and she'd apologize, saying she just couldn't shake the feeling that comfort was temporary. This is why her humanitarian work later in life wasn't just celebrity charity, it was deeply personal. She saw herself in every hungry child, every desperate mother. And here's something that will break your heart. She carried a small pouch of dirt from her childhood garden in Holland with her everywhere she went. When she felt overwhelmed by Hollywood phoniness or the absurdity of her fame, she'd touch that pouch and remember where she came from. Remember that survival was sacred, and that her platform was a responsibility, not a privilege. Let's shift gears to the men who made us laugh because comedy often comes from the darkest places. Lucille Ball, before she became the queen of television, had a secret talent that she used to survive the lean years in Hollywood. She was an exceptional seamstress and secretly worked as a tailor, altering clothes for other actresses who couldn't afford studio costumers for their personal wardrobes. She never advertised this service. It was all word of mouth among struggling performers. But here's the kicker. If she found out an actress was truly desperate, truly on the verge of giving up and leaving Hollywood, Lucy would deliberately botch the alteration slightly, insist on fixing it, and then forget to collect payment. She'd tell them they could pay her when they booked their next job, but she kept no records, sent no reminders. It was her way of giving charity to women who were too proud to accept charity. Years later, when she was the most powerful woman in television, several famous actresses came forward with stories of how Lucy's forgetfulness about payment had been the thing that allowed them to stay in Hollywood one more month, to make it to that one audition that changed everything. Lucy would just shrug and say she had a terrible memory for debts, but everyone knew the truth. Here's something about James Stewart that will make you see every one of his earnest, decent characters in a new light. Jimmy Stewart struggled with what we now call PTSD from his service in World War II. He flew combat missions, witnessed the deaths of men under his command, and came back a changed man. But in the 1940s and 50s, men didn't talk about psychological trauma. Stewart's secret coping mechanism? He would visit hospitals, not military hospitals where he might be recognized and asked to do publicity, but children's hospitals. He'd dress in ordinary clothes, tell the staff he was just a volunteer, and he'd read to sick kids for hours. He had a particular fondness for reading to children who were terminal, who wouldn't get to grow up and see all those dreams come true. Stewart believed that every child deserved to have adventures, even if they could only have them through stories. He did this for over 30 years, never once allowing a photographer to document it, never mentioning it in interviews. The only reason we know is because a nurse who'd watched him comfort a dying child wrote about it in her personal diary, which was later donated to a medical history archive. Stewart's kindness, his gentle presence, was the last positive memory for dozens of children, and he considered it his most important role, far more significant than any Oscar. Now let's explore the complicated beauty of Elizabeth Taylor, a woman who lived life in full technicolor. Everyone knows she loved jewels, marriages, and grand gestures. But her secret passion? Nursing stray animals back to health. Taylor had a private veterinary clinic built on one of her properties, fully staffed and equipped, dedicated solely to treating animals that others had given up on. Injured wildlife, abused dogs, neglected cats. If an animal needed help and no one else would provide it, somehow that animal ended up at Elizabeth Taylor's sanctuary. She spent millions on this over the decades, and she was hands-on, not just writing checks. She'd bottle feed baby animals through the night, she'd sit with dying creatures so they wouldn't be alone, and she learned veterinary nursing techniques so she could provide supportive care. The staff was sworn to secrecy because Taylor didn't want it to become a circus. She didn't want people showing up with animals just to meet her. This was her private act of love in a life that was otherwise lived entirely in the public eye. When she died, her will designated that the sanctuary continue in perpetuity, funded by a trust she'd established. It's still operating today, and they still don't advertise the Taylor connection because, as her will stipulated, the animals don't care who I was, and the work matters more than my name. Let's talk about the ultimate Hollywood bad boy, Marlon Brando. Brando's reputation was as a rebel, a method actor who didn't play by the rules, someone who was notoriously difficult on set. But his secret? He was funding the education of Native American students decades before it was fashionable to care about indigenous rights. Brando, who famously refused his Oscar for The Godfather and sent a Native American activist in his place to protest Hollywood's treatment of indigenous peoples, had already been quietly paying for Native American kids to go to college since the 1950s. He established a scholarship fund that he personally administered, reading every application himself, writing personal letters to each recipient. But here's the extraordinary part. He didn't just pay tuition. He paid for books, housing, food, transportation home for holidays, everything. And if a student was struggling academically or personally, Brando would call them. Marlon Brando would pick up the phone and talk to some 18-year-old kid he'd never met, offering encouragement, advice, sometimes just listening. He saw education as reparations, as his personal responsibility given the privilege he'd been afforded. Several of these students became doctors, lawyers, teachers, and activists who transformed their communities, and they all spoke of this famous actor who believed in them when no one else did. Here's a secret about Grace Kelly that adds a bittersweet layer to her fairytale story. Before she became Princess Grace of Monaco, Kelly was engaged in a passionate secret affair that had nothing to do with romance. She was learning magic tricks. Professional, stage-quality illusions. She studied under a renowned magician who made her promise never to reveal her training because he believed magic should remain mysterious. Grace loved the idea of transformation, of making people believe in the impossible, and she saw a connection between magic and acting. Both required you to make people suspend their disbelief and enter a world of wonder. She became quite skilled, and at private parties with close friends, she'd perform elaborate card tricks and small illusions. Her dream, which she confided only to a few people, was to one day perform magic for sick children, to bring wonder to kids who desperately needed it. After she became princess and her life became even more constrained by protocol and expectation, she couldn't pursue this passion openly. But hospital staff in Monaco would occasionally report mysterious visits from a woman in a headscarf who would perform magic tricks for pediatric patients and then disappear. They all knew who it was, but they protected her secret, allowing their princess this one space of pure, unencumbered joy. Let's venture into the world of the greatest dancer Hollywood ever knew, Fred Astaire. The man who made dancing look effortless, whose grace and precision set the standard for generations, had a secret that humanizes him in the most touching way. Fred Astaire was dyslexic at a time when learning disabilities were not understood or accommodated. Reading scripts was torture for him. The words would jumble and swim on the page. So how did he deliver such nuanced performances? His sister Adele, and later his wife Phyllis, would read all his scripts aloud to him, multiple times, until he had them memorized. He'd then annotate his scripts with symbols and drawings instead of words, creating a visual language only he understood. But Astaire was deeply ashamed of this difficulty, believing it made him less intelligent, less worthy. What he did with that shame is remarkable. He sought out young people in the film industry who were struggling with reading or learning differences, and he became a secret mentor to them. He couldn't offer academic help, but he could offer something more valuable. Proof that these challenges didn't have to define your limits. He taught them workarounds, coping strategies, and most importantly, he taught them that their worth wasn't determined by their ability to read a page the same way everyone else did. Several successful directors, actors, and writers credit Astaire's quiet mentorship with giving them the confidence to continue in an industry that demanded perfection. Now, let's discuss someone whose name might not be as familiar to younger generations but whose impact on Hollywood was immense, Bette Davis. Davis was known for playing strong, often unlikable women, and her off-screen reputation was as someone who didn't suffer fools. But her secret reveals a woman of extraordinary compassion. Davis's younger sister, Bobby, had severe developmental disabilities, and in an era when institutions were the norm and families often hid disabled relatives, Bette Davis refused. She bought a large home and converted it into a private facility where her sister could live with dignity, surrounded by trained professionals who treated residents as full human beings worthy of respect and love. But Davis didn't stop there. She opened the facility to other families who couldn't afford quality care for their disabled children and adults. She funded it almost entirely herself, charging only what families could afford to pay, and many paid nothing. She visited constantly, not for photo opportunities but because she genuinely loved these individuals who society had cast aside. She'd organize parties, bring in entertainers, and treat everyone like the valued individuals they were. When people would compliment her on her charity, she'd bristle and say, "It's not charity to treat human beings like human beings. That's just basic decency." The facility operated for decades, long after Bobby's death, because Davis' will ensured it would continue. Many families never knew they were receiving support from one of Hollywood's biggest stars. They just knew their loved ones were safe, happy, and treated with dignity. Here's something about Rock Hudson that takes on profound meaning given what we now know about his life. Hudson, who lived in terror of his sexuality being exposed in an era when it would have destroyed his career and possibly his life, had a secret tradition. Every Thanksgiving, he would quietly arrange for a massive dinner to be served at an LGBTQ+ community center in downtown Los Angeles. We're talking turkey, all the trimmings, desserts, everything. But he didn't just fund it. He showed up and served the food himself. To protect everyone involved, including himself, he'd come in disguise. A beard, glasses, different hair, ordinary clothes. The regulars at the center knew who he was, of course, but they protected him because he was one of them, vulnerable in the same ways they were. He'd sit and eat with people, listen to their stories, offer encouragement, and for those few hours, Rock Hudson the movie star disappeared, and he was just Rock, a gay man finding community and connection in a world that told him he shouldn't exist. After his death from AIDS brought his sexuality into the public eye, dozens of people came forward with stories of his kindness, his generosity, his quiet activism. He gave money to people for rent, medical bills, and legal fees, all while knowing he could never publicly stand with them. The weight of that secrecy, of helping his community while having to deny they were his community, is almost unbearable to contemplate. Let's talk about the legendary Katharine Hepburn, a woman who defined independence and fierce individuality. Hepburn's secret. She was a firefighter. Well, not officially, but sort of. Hepburn had a borderline obsessive fear of fire, stemming from a childhood trauma when a neighbor's house burned down with a family inside. As an adult, she dealt with this fear by learning everything possible about fire prevention and firefighting. She took courses, trained with local fire departments, and had her homes equipped with state-of-the-art fire suppression systems. But here's where it gets interesting. She befriended firefighters wherever she lived, and she'd donate equipment to underfunded fire stations. More than that, she'd show up at fire stations with home-cooked meals, especially on holidays. This legendary actress would cook massive quantities of food and deliver them personally to firefighters working on Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's. She'd stay and eat with them, ask about their lives, and treat them like the heroes she believed they were. Many firefighters reported that Hepburn seemed more relaxed in the firehouse than she did at Hollywood parties. She found the company of these practical, brave people far more appealing than Hollywood phonies. And if there was a fire in her neighborhood, Hepburn would show up, not to gawk but to help coordinate relief efforts for displaced families. She'd open her checkbook, make calls, and use her celebrity to make sure people got the help they needed. Now we come to someone whose tragedy obscured her incredible kindness: Judy Garland. Garland's life was marked by exploitation, addiction, and heartbreak, but through it all, she maintained a secret practice that shows her fundamental goodness. Garland would write letters to strangers who were suffering. She'd read the newspaper every day, looking for stories of tragedy: a family who lost their home to a fire, a child battling illness, a veteran struggling with poverty. She'd write them long, heartfelt letters, not from Judy Garland the celebrity, but from Frances Gumm, her real name. She'd share her own struggles with depression, with feeling inadequate, with battling addiction. She was vulnerable and honest in ways she could never be in public. She'd include money when she had it, sometimes just $20, sometimes much more, depending on her own financial state, which was often precarious. But more than money, she offered solidarity. She told people, "You are not alone in your suffering. I see you, and you matter." Some recipients recognized the handwriting or the return address and realized these letters were coming from Dorothy herself, but many never knew. They just knew that a woman named Frances understood their pain and took the time to reach out. Hundreds of these letters have surfaced over the years, and they reveal a soul of deep compassion and empathy, someone who knew pain intimately and didn't want others to face it alone. Let's explore the world of Ava Gardner, one of the most beautiful women to ever grace the screen. Gardner's secret passion was supporting elderly performers who'd fallen on hard times. Hollywood has never been kind to people once their star fades, and Gardner, even at the height of her fame, was keenly aware that youth and beauty were temporary. She established a private fund, administered through a lawyer to maintain her anonymity, that provided monthly stipends to former actors, dancers, and crew members who were struggling financially. We're not talking about famous people who'd mismanaged their money. These were character actors, bit players, stunt people, seamstresses, people who'd worked their whole lives in the industry and had nothing to show for it. Gardner ensured they could afford rent, food, and medication. She'd occasionally visit them, always calling ahead to make sure they were comfortable with a visit, never making it about her or her charity. She just wanted to sit and listen to their stories, to honor their contributions to an industry that had forgotten them. One actress who received support for 15 years without knowing the source said, when she finally found out after Gardner's death, "I always wondered how I'd become so lucky. Now I know I wasn't lucky. I was loved by someone who understood that all of us, no matter how bright we shine, eventually fade, and we shouldn't have to fade alone." Here's something about Charlton Heston that will surprise you, given his later political persona. In the 1960s, Heston was actively involved in the civil rights movement in ways that went far beyond marching in Washington. Heston used his fame to integrate restaurants, hotels, and other businesses by simply showing up with black colleagues and refusing to accept service unless everyone was served. He'd cause massive scenes, attracting press attention, and making it financially and socially untenable for these establishments to continue discriminating. But his real secret work. He was funding freedom riders, paying bail for protesters, and hiring expensive lawyers to defend civil rights activists who couldn't afford representation. He did this quietly, through intermediaries, because he believed the focus should be on the movement, not on his participation. He received death threats, was blacklisted by certain producers, and lost work because of his activism. Later in life, his politics shifted dramatically, which makes this period of his life more complicated and interesting. But in those crucial years of the civil rights movement, Charlton Heston put his money, his safety, and his career on the line for justice, and he did much of it in secret because he believed true allyship didn't require applause. Let's talk about someone whose comedic genius often overshadowed his depth. Cary Grant, again, because this man was a walking contradiction in the best ways. Beyond his thrift store suits project, Grant had another secret. He was in therapy for decades, starting in the 1950s when psychotherapy was stigmatized, especially for men. But Grant didn't just attend therapy. He became an advocate for it among his friends and colleagues. He'd quietly recommend his therapist to fellow actors who were struggling, often offering to pay for their sessions anonymously. He believed that Hollywood's culture of toxic masculinity and emotional repression was destroying people, and he made it his personal mission to create a quiet network of support. Some of Hollywood's most famous leading men were secretly in therapy funded by Cary Grant, working through their traumas, addictions, and fears. Grant never told anyone who he was helping. Those men only found out when they received anonymous notes after his death, revealing that their therapy had been his gift to them. One note read, "You deserved help, and I was privileged to provide it. The only payment I ask is that you pass on this kindness to someone else who's drowning." Many of them did exactly that, creating a ripple effect of mental health support in an industry that desperately needed it. Now, prepare yourself for this revelation about Marilyn Monroe, because it adds yet another dimension to a woman who was far more complex than the world gave her credit for. Monroe was secretly writing a book, a memoir of sorts, but not the kind of tell-all the tabloids would have expected. She was writing about philosophy, about the search for meaning in a world that valued surfaces over substance. She studied with professors from UCLA, reading Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and existentialist philosophy. She filled notebooks with her thoughts on existence, identity, and the performance of self. Some of these notebooks survived, and they reveal a brilliant, questing mind wrestling with profound questions. She wrote, "Everyone sees the mask and thinks it's my face. But I'm dying behind the mask, and no one thinks to look." Her secret plan was to publish this book under a pseudonym, to prove that her thoughts and words had value separate from her body and face. She never completed the project, and what remains is fragmentary but powerful. It forces us to reconsider everything we think we know about Marilyn Monroe and to grieve not just for her tragic death but for the brilliant work we lost when she died. Let's discuss Paul Newman, a man whose philanthropic work later in life became well known, but whose early secret charity was not. Newman grew up working class, and he never forgot the sting of being the kid who couldn't afford things his peers took for granted. So starting from his very first studio paycheck, Newman began a practice he continued for his entire career. He would identify one struggling family in whatever town he was filming and anonymously pay their bills for the duration of the production. Rent, utilities, groceries, medical bills, all of it, funneled through local churches or charities to protect his identity. He'd have assistants research families who were on the brink, people who were working hard but barely holding on, and he'd throw them a lifeline. Sometimes it was just for a few months, but sometimes, if he was filming a long production, it would be for a year or more. The only stipulation was that the family never know who was helping them. Newman believed that dignity required mystery. If people knew Paul Newman was paying their bills, it would change the dynamic, make it about celebrity rather than simple human compassion. Hundreds of families over the decades were touched by this secret generosity, and most never knew. It was only after his death, when researchers went through his financial records for estate purposes, that the scope of his giving became clear. Here's a story about Greta Garbo that will break the Ice Queen image history has given her. Garbo, famous for wanting to be alone, for avoiding the spotlight, had a secret life that was rich with connection. She would disguise herself, dress in men's clothing, and spend time in the poorest neighborhoods of New York City, where she lived after retiring from Hollywood. She'd sit in diners, cafes, and parks, just talking to people, homeless veterans, struggling immigrants, elderly folks who lived alone. She was genuinely curious about their lives, their stories, their perspectives. And she'd help in small, personal ways. Paying someone's diner bill, slipping money into a coat pocket, connecting people with resources. She carried a notebook where she'd write down what people told her, not to exploit their stories but to remember them, to honor them. After her death, dozens of these notebooks were found, filled with the stories of ordinary people she'd befriended over decades. One entry reads, "Met a man today who lost his wife of 50 years. He said the silence in his apartment is louder than any sound he ever heard. I understand that silence. We sat together for 2 hours, two silent people, and somehow it was the most honest conversation I've had in years." Garbo's desire to be alone wasn't about misanthropy. It was about escaping the falseness of fame so she could have authentic human connections. Let me tell you about James Dean, whose life was tragically cut short but who packed an extraordinary amount of compassion into his brief time. Dean had a secret ritual. He would visit juvenile detention centers and talk to troubled kids. He'd been a troubled kid himself, angry at the world, searching for belonging and purpose. He believed he could reach these kids in ways social workers and counselors couldn't because he spoke their language. He'd talk about his own struggles with authority, his feelings of not fitting in, his rage at a world that seemed designed to crush anyone who was different. But he'd also talk about channeling that rage into art, into something creative and meaningful. He'd encourage these kids to write, draw, perform, anything to express what they were feeling. Several of these young people later credited Dean with saving their lives, with making them feel seen and valued at a crucial moment. Dean never publicized these visits, never allowed press to document them. This was personal for him, not a PR opportunity. When he died at 24, several formerly incarcerated young men showed up at his funeral, crying openly, saying that this strange, intense actor had been the only person who ever looked at them and saw potential instead of just problems. Let's talk about Joan Crawford because her story is complicated, and the truth is far more nuanced than either the hagiography or the later demonization suggests. Crawford had a secret practice that reveals both her vulnerability and her desire to connect beyond the superficiality of Hollywood. She would write long letters to fans who wrote to her about their problems, not just brief responses but detailed, thoughtful letters offering advice, encouragement, and sometimes money. She'd spend hours each week on this correspondence, treating it as seriously as any professional obligation. She saw these fans as real people deserving of respect and attention, not just sources of adulation. When fans wrote about loneliness, Crawford would write back about her own devastating loneliness, about how fame isolated her, about how she'd trade all the glamour for one genuine friend who saw beyond the movie star. These letters reveal a woman who was far more self-aware and emotionally intelligent than her screen persona suggested. She wrote to one fan, "You say you feel invisible, that the world looks through you rather than at you. I'm one of the most famous women in the world, and I feel exactly the same way. Perhaps we're all invisible in our own ways, and the best we can do is try to truly see each other." Hundreds of these letters exist in archives, and they complicate the narrative of Crawford as simply a monster, revealing instead a deeply wounded person trying to make authentic connections in an inauthentic world. Now let's discuss Sidney Poitier, a man who broke barriers and changed cinema, but whose secret kindness extended far beyond his professional achievements. Poitier established a secret fund to pay for college educations for the children of sanitation workers, postal carriers, and other municipal employees in New York City and Los Angeles. He believed that these workers were the backbone of society, doing essential work that was undervalued and underpaid, and he wanted their children to have opportunities that economic circumstances might otherwise deny them. Over 40 years, he funded hundreds of college educations, always anonymously. Recipients would receive letters saying they'd been selected for a private scholarship, with no mention of Poitier's involvement. He'd attend some of their graduations, sitting in the back, never identifying himself, just wanting to witness the fruit of his investment in these young people. Many went on to become teachers, doctors, lawyers, and community leaders, never knowing that one of cinema's most dignified men had quietly opened doors for them. Let's talk about someone whose name might not be familiar to everyone, but whose face certainly is, character actor Ward Bond. Bond appeared in countless westerns and war films, usually playing tough, gruff men. His secret: he was functionally illiterate for most of his life. He'd learned to read at a very basic level, but comprehension and writing were enormous struggles. In Hollywood, a place that revered scripts and worshipped writers, Bond felt deeply ashamed of this limitation. But instead of letting it defeat him, he developed extraordinary compensatory skills. He had a photographic memory and could memorize entire scripts after hearing them read aloud just a few times. He'd have fellow actors, directors, or his wife read scripts to him, and he'd commit every word to memory. But here's the beautiful secret. Once Bond became financially successful, he started funding adult literacy programs. He'd donate to libraries, schools, and community centers that offered literacy education, always anonymously because he was too ashamed to publicly admit his own struggles. Late in his life, Bond himself enrolled in an adult literacy program, determined to finally master the skills that had eluded him. His tutor, a college student who had no idea she was teaching a famous actor, said Bond was the most dedicated student she ever had. He died before fully achieving his goal, but his will established a foundation that still funds adult literacy programs, helping others overcome the shame and limitation he knew too well. Now let's discuss the incomparable Dorothy Dandridge, a woman whose talent and beauty should have made her one of Hollywood's biggest stars but whose race limited her opportunities in heartbreaking ways. Dandridge's secret was that she was functionally raising and supporting multiple families. Not just her own daughter, who had severe developmental disabilities and required constant care, but also the children of friends and family members who'd fallen on hard times. She'd pay for their housing, food, education, and medical care, stretching her finances to the breaking point and beyond. When she finally went bankrupt, it wasn't because of personal extravagance, though the press loved to imply as much. It was because she couldn't say no when people she loved needed help. She'd rather go broke herself than see a child go hungry or a friend lose their home. In her final years, when she was struggling financially and professionally, some of the people she'd supported for years turned their backs on her, which added a bitter layer to her already tragic story. But others remained loyal, visiting her, supporting her emotionally even when they couldn't help financially. When she died alone in her apartment, possibly by suicide, possibly by accidental overdose, those loyal few were the ones who organized her funeral and fought to preserve her legacy. Dorothy Dandridge gave everything she had to others and died with almost nothing for herself, a generosity that the world she lived in simply didn't deserve. Let's discuss someone who represents old Hollywood's transition to television. Desi Arnaz. Everyone knows Desi as Lucille's husband and business partner, but his secret legacy is technological. Arnaz was a genuine innovator who invented and perfected technologies that became standard in television production. But instead of jealously guarding these patents and techniques, he shared them freely with other producers and studios. He believed that improving television as a medium was more important than personal profit. He'd invite competitors to watch how he was filming I Love Lucy, explain the 3-camera setup he'd pioneered, and share the techniques that made it work. Other producers were baffled by this openness, but Arnaz believed that a rising tide lifted all boats, that better television overall meant more opportunities for everyone. Beyond technology, Arnaz had a secret practice of hiring Latino crew members and performers at a time when Hispanics were almost entirely excluded from behind-the-camera roles. He couldn't always feature them on camera because the networks and sponsors wouldn't allow it, but he could employ them and train them, creating a pipeline of skilled Latino professionals in an industry that had locked them out. Many successful Latino producers, directors, and cinematographers credit Arnaz with giving them their start, with believing in them when no one else would. Here's a secret about Natalie Wood that reveals both Hollywood's darkness and her attempt to find light within it. Wood, who started as a child actor and never really had a childhood, made a decision as an adult. She would try to protect other child actors from the exploitation and abuse she'd endured. She became a confidant and advocate for young performers, especially young girls, offering them someone to talk to who truly understood the unique pressures and dangers they faced. She'd warn them about predatory producers and directors, teaching them how to set boundaries and when to walk away from situations that felt unsafe. She couldn't change the system, couldn't stop the abuse that was endemic in Hollywood, but she could try to protect individuals. Wood also funded therapy for child actors, knowing that many would develop psychological issues from their unnatural childhoods, just as she had. She'd connect young performers with trusted therapists, often paying for sessions herself. Tragically, Wood died at 43 under mysterious circumstances, and we'll never know what more she might have done to protect vulnerable young people in Hollywood. But those she helped, several of whom are still alive, speak of her maternal presence, her fierce protectiveness, and her determination that others not suffer as she had suffered. In an industry built on exploiting youth and beauty, Natalie Wood tried to be a shield, a protector, and that legacy matters. Let me tell you about Gregory Peck, a man whose on-screen dignity matched his off-screen character. Peck's secret. He was running an informal employment agency for older actors and crew members. As Hollywood became obsessed with youth in the 1960s and 70s, talented people in their 50s, 60s, and 70s found themselves unemployable, considered too old despite their skills and experience. Peck would use his influence to create jobs for these people, insisting on hiring them for his productions, connecting them with other producers, and sometimes personally funding independent projects just to employ people who needed work. He'd have his staff track down actors who disappeared from the industry, often finding them in desperate circumstances, and he'd find ways to help that preserved their dignity. He might hire someone as a consultant, a coach, or an advisor, creating positions that allowed them to earn money without feeling like they were accepting charity. One older actress said, "Gregory Peck gave me back my purpose. I wasn't just a washed-up former starlet. I was a professional with valuable experience, and he made sure I knew that my contributions still mattered." Peck's quiet determination to honor the contributions of older professionals stands as a rebuke to an industry that has always worshipped youth at the expense of wisdom.